Nobody warns you about manipulators. They tell you about the explosive betrayals, the lipstick on the collar, the late-night text that lights up the wrong side of the bed. What they don't tell you is that some marriages don't explode. They evaporate. Quietly. Politely. Right in front of your face while you're passing the dinner rolls. My name is Harrison Princeton, and I was married to the most beautiful liar I've ever known. Welcome back to Dad's Sweet Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, every villain in these stories thought they were the smartest person in the room. They were not. Subscribe so you never miss a story. Courtney and I met at a mutual friend's cookout in the summer of 2009. She was wearing a yellow sundress and laughing at something that probably wasn't that funny. But her laugh was the kind that made you want to be funny just to hear it again. I was 31, a mid-level project manager at a logistics firm, driving a sensible Toyota and renting a decent 2-bedroom apartment. Nothing spectacular. Nothing flashy. Just Harrison Princeton. Steady, dependable, boring to some, solid to her. Or so I thought. She was 28 and worked as an administrative coordinator at Denise Collins Consulting, a mid-size HR firm. Smart, organized, socially magnetic. We dated for 14 months, and every one of those months felt like a highlight reel. Weekend road trips, cooking disasters that ended in takeout and laughter, long conversations on the porch that stretched past midnight. I thought I'd found my person. I proposed at a restaurant called the Fig and Flame, nothing extravagant but thoughtful. Candles, a jazz quartet in the corner, a ring I'd spent 3 months saving for. She cried, said yes, called her mother from the table. We got married in March 2011. I didn't know it then, but I should have paid closer attention to what made her laugh at that cookout. It wasn't a joke. It was a man in a BMW talking about his lake house. The first 2 years were good. Not perfect. Nothing is. But genuinely good. We bought a house in Pearland, south of Houston. 3 bedrooms, a backyard, a neighborhood where people actually waved at you. Courtney planted a garden in the spring of 2012 and abandoned it by June. I didn't know that was a metaphor at the time. The change started sometime around year 3. It was subtle at first. The kind of subtle that, when you look back, you feel stupid for missing. But you don't miss it because you're blind. You miss it because you're trusting someone you love, and trust is just another word for voluntary blindness. She started caring about money differently, not more carefully, more desperately. She'd come home from work and instead of telling me about her day, she'd scroll through Instagram looking at vacation homes in Turks and Caicos and say things like, "People our age shouldn't still be driving Camrys." "I drive a Camry," I said once. "Exactly," she said, not even looking up. I told myself it was stress. She'd been passed over for a promotion at Denise's firm. It stung her pride. I understood that. I gave her space and understanding and all the things good husbands are supposed to give. What I didn't give her was apparently a 6-figure bonus and a corner office. Those were above my pay grade. The bedroom started cooling around year 4, and I want to be careful here, because what came later was designed to make me feel like that was my fault. "You're just not very present," she said one night. We were lying side by side. Ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, that specific silence that married people know, the one that's louder than a fight. "What does that mean?" "It means," she paused, choosing her words or maybe loading them. "It means, sometimes I feel like I'm with someone who's going through the motions." I stared at the ceiling for a long time. "I don't feel that way. I'm right here." You can't cite evidence against someone's emotions, so I apologized, even though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for. And we went to sleep like 2 countries that had just signed a ceasefire neither side planned to honor. She started working late in the spring of 2015. The firm had brought in a new director, a man named Ryan Richardson. I heard the name casually at first. Ryan thinks the onboarding structure needs to be overhauled. Ryan made a really sharp point in the meeting today. Ryan got us box seats to the Astros game for client appreciation. Ryan. I met him once at a company holiday party that December. Tall, tanned, the kind of jaw that looked chiseled specifically to make other men feel like they assembled themselves wrong. He wore a watch that cost more than my monthly mortgage. He shook my hand with both of his and said, "Courtney talks about you all the time." He smiled when he said it, the kind of smile that says exactly the opposite. I didn't know it yet, but that handshake was Ryan Richardson's way of telling me something I wasn't ready to hear. By 2016, the complaints had evolved from vague feelings into specific accusations. And the primary charge, the one Courtney returned to again and again like a prosecutor who'd found their star exhibit, was my performance in bed. Now, and I cannot stress this enough, this was new information. For the first 4 years of our marriage, there had been no complaints. None. Zero. In fact, I have very specific memories suggesting the opposite. But revisionist history is a specialty of people who need justification for what they've already decided to do. You're just not passionate, she'd say. You don't initiate. I feel like a task on your to-do list. Each one landed like a brick. Because the thing about someone cataloging your failures in the one space where vulnerability lives, the bedroom, where you're literally exposed, is that it works. It erodes you. You start to believe it. You start to walk through your own house like a guest who's overstayed his welcome. I suggested counseling. She dismissed it. I don't need to pay someone to tell me what I already know. What she already knew, I was starting to understand, had nothing to do with me. The bedroom performance issue wasn't a problem to solve. It was a story she was building, a narrative she'd need later when she was ready to use it. My friend Paul Terry, the kind of friend who tells you things you're not ready to hear, which is the only kind worth having, sat across from me at a bar in Midtown one Thursday night and said it plainly. Man, the way you're describing this, she's not unhappy with you in bed. She's unhappy with your tax bracket. That's harsh, I said. It's not harsh, it's just arithmetic. Add it up. When did she stop being satisfied? Right around when Richardson showed up. What does Richardson have that you don't? About $400,000 a year and a Rolex. I drank my beer. You don't know that. No, Paul said. But you do. He was right. I did. I'd known for months. I just hadn't let myself say it out loud, because some truths feel like they'll burn your mouth on the way out. I want to tell you that I confronted her, that I said the thing, drew the line, demanded answers. But I didn't. Not yet. Because there's a version of yourself, the one who still believes in the life you built, and you protect that version for as long as you possibly can, even when protecting it means swallowing glass. My sister-in-law's name was Abby Smith. She'd married Courtney's older brother Tom, 2 years after our own wedding. Abby was the kind of woman who sharpened her knives in public and called it personality. She had a talent for saying vicious things in a tone so casual you'd spend 10 minutes after the conversation wondering if you'd imagined it. The family dinner was in October 2017, a birthday celebration for Courtney's mother. Long table, 11 people, good wine, mediocre lasagna. Everything was fine until the second bottle was opened. Abby had had a glass and a half too many, which was usually when her talent for cruelty reached its peak performance. She looked at me from 3 seats down and said with a smile warm enough to confuse you, Harrison, honest question. Do you think you'd actually cry if Courtney cheated on you? Like would there be tears? The table went quiet for exactly 1 second. Then it roared. Not all of it. Tom had the decency to look uncomfortable. Courtney's mother looked at her plate. But Abby was laughing, and 3 cousins were laughing, and that was enough to make the silence of the others irrelevant. I looked at Courtney. She didn't defend me. She didn't say a word to stop it. She picked up her wine glass, tilted her head slightly in the way she did when she was about to say something she'd been saving, and said, He's basically a statue in bed. More laughter. I sat very still. I have thought about that moment many times since then. What I felt, what I should have felt. What I actually felt was a kind of clarifying quiet, like the moment just before a thunderstorm when the birds go silent and the air smells like electricity. Everything was suddenly perfectly clear. I picked up my fork, I took a bite of food, I chewed it, I swallowed, I set the fork down. Understood, I said. Abby blinked. She was expecting something more. Anger, embarrassment, some reaction she could feed on. Understood, gave her nothing. The table moved on. Someone changed the subject. The wine kept flowing. I sat there for another 40 minutes. I was pleasant. I helped clear the plates. I shook hands and said goodnight. That night I went home, waited for Courtney to fall asleep, and packed a bag. I left at 2:47 in the morning. Didn't slam the door, didn't leave a note. Just walked out like a man who'd already said everything he needed to say. I blocked Courtney. I blocked Abby. I blocked Tom. I blocked every number attached to that dinner table. Then, I disappeared. Let me tell you what disappearing actually looks like. Because it's not romantic, it's not a montage with good music and a determined jaw. It's a 6-month sublet in a studio apartment in the Midtown area of Houston, with a window that faced a parking garage. It's eating cereal for dinner 3 times a week because cooking for one feels like a punchline. It's lying awake at 3 a.m., not because you're plotting anything, but because grief, yes, grief, that's what it was, doesn't follow a schedule. I filed for divorce through an attorney and had the papers served to Courtney at work. That part, I'll admit, I chose deliberately. She'd humiliated me publicly. She'd used my vulnerability as dinner party ammunition. The least I could do was make the paperwork arrive somewhere she cared about appearances. Paul told me she called him twice in the first week. She sounded genuinely surprised. He said, "Good," I said. She said you overreacted. I laughed. I hadn't laughed in weeks, so it felt strange in my chest. Of course she did. She'd moved in with Ryan Richardson by November. I heard this not through any intentional surveillance. I'd blocked everyone, but through my colleague at work, a woman named Denise Collins, who knew someone who knew someone. Houston is a big city that operates like a small town if you're paying attention. Ryan Richardson was everything I wasn't, financially speaking. Director of client relations at a major consulting firm. 2 investment properties, a Range Rover and a boat he took out maybe 4 times a year because owning a boat is more about the identity than the water. Courtney had traded up, on paper anyway. On paper, she'd made a rational decision. Paper doesn't know everything. While she was settling into Ryan's River Oaks condo, I was doing something quieter. I'd spent 8 years in logistics management, and in that time I'd developed something that doesn't show up on a resume but absolutely should. I knew how supply chains worked at a structural level, and I knew where the inefficiencies were. I'd been sitting on a software concept for 2 years, a route optimization platform for mid-sized distribution companies. The ones too small for enterprise solutions but too large for spreadsheets. I'd never built it because I'd been too busy maintaining a marriage that was managing my confidence like a controlled demolition. Now I had nothing but time and a parking garage view. I called an old college contact, a developer named Mike who owed me a favor and had the skills I lacked. We started building in January 2018. I poured everything into it, not out of ambition exactly. More like necessity. When your identity gets stripped down to nothing, you find out what's actually underneath. Underneath Harrison Princeton, apparently, was someone who understood logistics deeply enough to build something from scratch. The divorce finalized in April. No children, thank God. The house sold and we split the equity. I walked away with enough to fund the startup for 8 months. I named the company Precision Path Logistics. I didn't name it after myself. I didn't name it after anything dramatic. I named it after what it did, because I'd spent enough of my life performing for an audience. The software didn't need to impress anyone. It just needed to work. It worked. By August 2018, we had 4 paying clients. Small companies, modest contracts, but they renewed. In this business, renewal is the only applause that matters. By January 2019, we had 11 clients and had just closed a Series A funding round. $2.3 million from a venture group out of Austin that had been watching the logistics tech space. Paul called me the night I wired the paperwork and said, "Man, you actually did it." "We're nowhere near done," I said. "Harrison, yeah, you actually did it." I smiled at my parking garage view. I'd moved into a real apartment by then. Top floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Houston spread out like a circuit board. Below. "Yeah," I said. "I did." What I didn't tell Paul was that I already knew what was coming next. Not because I'd been planning revenge. That's the thing people always get wrong about this kind of story. Revenge requires constant tending. You have to nurse it, feed it, keep the anger warm. I didn't have time for that. I'd been building something. But there's a difference between hunting someone and simply knowing where they'll eventually be standing when the landscape shifts. Ryan Richardson's company, Meridian Consulting Group, had been struggling. I knew this because the logistics industry is a web, and I was now a node in it. Meridian had overextended on a series of enterprise contracts in 2018, and their client retention rate had dropped. By early 2019, there were quiet conversations in the industry about acquisition targets. My firm wasn't the acquirer, but one of our largest new clients, a holding company called Vantage Bridge Capital, was. In March 2019, Vantage Bridge acquired Meridian Consulting Group. I wasn't in the room for the acquisition. I didn't need to be. What I was the new Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at Vantage Bridge, a role they'd created specifically when they brought Precision Path in as their operational tech partner. My software, my relationship, my seat at the table. I'd earned every square inch of it. I want you to picture the org chart. At the top, Vantage Bridge Capital. Below them, the newly acquired Meridian Consulting Group, embedded in Meridian, reporting upward to a VP of Strategic Partnerships, who had operational oversight of all acquired entities. That VP was me. Ryan Richardson now reported through 2 layers of corporate structure to a man he'd once smiled at over a 2-handed handshake while sleeping with his wife. I want to be very clear. I did not manufacture this. I did not engineer it. What I did was build something valuable enough that opportunity presented itself, and I had the sense to walk through the door. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel anything when I saw his name on the Meridian org chart. I felt a very quiet, very private satisfaction, the kind you don't share at dinner tables. The restructuring review began in May 2019. Standard post-acquisition procedure. Evaluate redundancies, streamline operations, realign roles. Vantage Bridge had brought me in specifically because I understood operational efficiency. That was my job. That was entirely legitimate. I did my job very well. Ryan Richardson had been Director of Client Relations at Meridian. In the new structure, that role was absorbed into a consolidated client experience division. The new division had one director, based in Austin, who'd come from the acquiring company. Ryan's position was, and I want to use the exact corporate language here, because corporate language is a work of art when you need it to be, transition to a support capacity pending role realignment. What that meant in plain English, he had a desk, a computer, no direct reports, no client contact, no travel budget, and nothing to do except watch other people have meetings through the glass wall of his new office. I didn't fire him. Firing him would have required conversation, documentation, maybe legal exposure. More than that, firing him would have been personal, and people notice when things are personal. What I gave him instead was irrelevance, a title that meant nothing, a calendar full of empty space. For a man like Ryan Richardson, a man whose identity was built entirely on status, whose value to women like Courtney was predicated on power and access, irrelevance was a far more precise instrument than termination. He lasted 7 months, resigned in December 2019 with a terse 2-paragraph email and no farewell party. I wasn't CC'd on it. I didn't need to be. Now, Abby Smith, Tom's wife, the woman who had opened that dinner table performance with, "Do you think you'd cry?" The architect of the evening's first humiliation, the one who'd given Courtney the stage. Abby worked in accounting at a financial services firm called Harland & Tusk. She had for 6 years. Harland & Tusk was not directly connected to anything in my orbit, until it was, because Vantage Bridge's third-quarter expansion included the acquisition of a boutique financial analytics company that shared a parent entity with Harland & Tusk. I'll spare you the corporate genealogy. The short version is, through a holding structure that would put a normal person to sleep, Abby's firm fell within a portfolio that Vantage Bridge now had oversight influence on. The restructuring memo that recommended her position be eliminated was 3 paragraphs long, signed by a middle manager in accounting review, and contained nothing that could be traced back to me, because it didn't need to. The decision was structurally sound. Her role genuinely had been duplicated by a function in the parent company. That was real. It was also convenient. She received a politely worded termination letter, citing role elimination, standard severance. Clean. I was told by someone peripherally connected to the situation that she'd cried in the HR meeting. I didn't find satisfaction in that part. The crying part was just collateral reality. What I'd removed was her certainty, the confidence of someone who'd never had a reason to believe actions had consequences. That certainty I had no sympathy for. She never found out who signed off at the top. I made exactly one call that mattered. Quiet, professional, to the right person. And the rest was the system doing what systems do. Courtney found out that Ryan had resigned in early January 2020. I know this because Paul told me. He'd run into Tom, who was apparently still speaking to everyone while trying not to take sides in a conflict he didn't fully understand. "She's struggling," Paul said. "That's not my concern." "I know. I'm just telling you." She had moved out of Ryan's place by February. He'd apparently not taken well to his new irrelevance. A man with nothing to offer tends to contract, and Courtney of all people understood the relationship between ambition and attraction. She'd chosen him for specific reasons, and those reasons had evaporated. The man she burned her marriage for turned out to be ordinary. That's the part she hadn't accounted for. She'd traded a statue in bed, her words, for a man whose entire appeal was tied to a title and a Range Rover. When the title disappeared, so did the appeal, So did the relationship. So did the version of herself she'd constructed around it. The text arrived on a Wednesday evening in March 2020. I was in my home office working late when my phone lit up. Unknown number. She must have gotten a new one, assuming my old block would transfer. It almost made me smile. The message was carefully written. I could tell she'd drafted it. It had that quality of over-considered casualness, the kind of precision that disguises itself as spontaneity. Hey Harrison, I know this is out of nowhere. I've been doing a lot of thinking. I'm not asking for anything. I just think maybe we should talk. For closure, if nothing else. I hope you're well. I read it once. I read it again. Then I set my phone face down on the desk and went back to work. I didn't block the number. I didn't respond. I just left it there, a message in a bottle that would never be answered, floating in a space where my regard for her used to be. She texted once more, 3 weeks later. 2 words, I understand. And that, more than anything, was the ending I would have written if I'd been writing it. She understood. The way I had understood, sitting at that dinner table with a fork in my hand in a room full of laughter aimed at me. The way I'd nodded and said nothing, and walked out of a chapter of my life with my dignity assembled. Some silences are devastating, not because they're aggressive, but because they're complete. It's been a while now. Precision Path has grown to 47 employees and services logistics partners in 9 states. Paul works for me, business development, because the man understands Tidio in a way spreadsheets never will. Mike, who built the first version of the software on a handshake, is our CTO and probably the smartest person in any room he walks into. I own a house now, not in Pearland. No offense to Pearland, but in the Heights area, an old craftsman bungalow that I've spent 3 years slowly renovating because I find that I enjoy building things. Turns out I always did. I just needed the right uninterrupted time. I don't hate Courtney. I want to be honest about that, because this kind of story invites a certain kind of ending. The triumphant ex-husband, cold and satisfied and superior. That's not the truth. The truth is more complicated, and I think more human. I grieve the marriage I thought I had. I grieve the version of her I fell in love with at that cookout, in the yellow sundress, laughing too loud. That woman may have been real. She may have just gotten lost somewhere between who she was and who she decided she needed to be. I don't know. What I know is that I sat at a dinner table and heard my wife tell 11 people I was a statue. And I looked around at the laughter, and I decided, very quietly with a fork in my hand, that I was done shrinking. Statues don't move. I moved, and I didn't stop. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories.